The flight attendant smirked as she blocked the elderly man's path. "Sir, first class is for priority passengers. You can't sit here." The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers watched, some whispering, some pretending not to notice. But no one, not even the flight crew, knew the truth. The man in the wheelchair wasn't just another passenger. He was the founder of the entire airline. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The airport was crowded with travelers rushing to their gates, rolling suitcases clicking against the tiled floors. Among them sat an elderly man in a wheelchair near the first-class boarding lane, quietly waiting for his turn. His posture was straight, his hands rested on the armrests, and his faded military jacket hung loosely over his thin frame. His eyes, sharp yet calm, scanned the departure screens as he waited. His name was Robert Lawson, though most people simply called him Sir out of respect. At least those who knew who he was. But today, respect was the last thing he would receive. A flight attendant, Emily Carter, stood at the gate, her arms crossed as she glanced around. She was one of those attendants who prided herself on keeping order, making sure everything ran exactly how she wanted it. Her uniform was crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect bun, and her expression was sharp. When her eyes landed on Robert, a flicker of irritation passed through them. He didn't look like he belonged in first class. He wasn't dressed in a tailored suit like the businessmen who usually sat in the front rows. He didn't carry an expensive briefcase. He didn't have the polished look of someone who had paid thousands for his ticket. She took a step forward, heels clicking against the floor, stopping right in front of him. "Sir, you'll need to wait until general boarding. First-class passengers are boarding now," she said in a firm voice, loud enough for those around to hear. Robert blinked up at her, his expression calm. "I am in first class," he said, his voice steady. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She had dealt with situations like this before. People sometimes received upgrades they didn't pay for, or were mistakenly assigned the wrong seats. She had no patience for these kinds of mix-ups. "I think you might be mistaken," she said, holding out her hand. "Let me see your ticket." Robert reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to her without a word. She barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "There must be a mistake. Where did you get this ticket?" Robert tilted his head slightly, but before he could answer, she turned to the gate agent standing nearby. "Can you check his ticket? There's no way." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. But the meaning was clear. There was no way someone like him was supposed to be in first class. The gate agent, a younger man named Daniel Reed, hesitated before scanning the ticket. After a moment, the screen beeped, confirming its validity. "His ticket is correct," Daniel said, his voice unsure as he looked between Robert and Emily. Emily's jaw tightened, but she wasn't ready to back down. She turned back to Robert, her tone clipped. "Well, even if the ticket is correct, we need to make sure that your wheelchair won't be blocking the aisle. First class has limited space, and we have to prioritize the comfort of other passengers." Robert didn't flinch. "I've traveled before. I know the rules," he said. Emily let out a short breath through her nose, clearly annoyed. She didn't argue further, but stepped aside with an exaggerated motion. "Fine. Just make sure you don't cause any inconvenience." Robert nodded slightly, rolling himself forward toward the jet bridge. A few passengers who had witnessed the exchange shifted uncomfortably, some looking away as if they hadn't seen anything, others exchanging glances but saying nothing. As Robert wheeled onto the plane, Emily followed behind him, her irritation barely hidden. She moved ahead of him quickly, reaching the first-class cabin before he did. When he arrived at his seat, she was already there, waiting with her arms crossed. "Are you going to need help with your seatbelt?" she asked, her voice laced with impatience. "Or are you able to manage on your own?" Robert looked at her, sensing the condescension in her voice. "I can handle it," he said simply. Emily gave a short nod, then turned on her heel without another word. As she walked away, she muttered something under her breath, just quiet enough that she thought he wouldn't hear. But Robert had spent years in situations where listening carefully had been a necessity. He heard her words clearly. First class isn't what it used to be. He let the words settle, watching as she continued down the aisle. flashing a bright smile at the well-dressed businessman in the next row, offering him a warm greeting that he had never received. Robert sat back in his seat, adjusting his jacket. He had faced worse than this in his life. He knew when to pick his battles. But something told him that this wasn't over. And as the engines hummed to life and the plane prepared for takeoff, he had a feeling that Emily had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The plane rumbled as it taxied toward the runway, the low hum of the engines filling the cabin. Passengers settled into their seats, flipping through in-flight magazines, adjusting their seatbelts, or scrolling through their phones. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, performing their final checks before takeoff. Emily Carter, still visibly annoyed, made her way through the first-class cabin, making sure everyone was situated. She stopped beside a middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit, flashing him a warm smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked in a sweet tone. The man glanced up and shook his head. "I'm good for now, thank you." Emily nodded before moving to the next row, greeting a well-dressed woman carrying a designer handbag. She took her time, making sure to offer special attention to certain passengers. But when she reached Robert Lawson's seat, she barely spared him a glance. Robert noticed it immediately. He wasn't expecting special treatment, but the difference in how she spoke to others compared to him was obvious. He watched as Emily adjusted a tray for another passenger with a bright smile. But when she passed him, her tone remained cold and professional, forced, as if she had to acknowledge him, but didn't want to. She turned to another flight attendant, Claire Mitchell, who had been silently observing the interaction. Claire had only been working with the airline for a year, but even she could tell something wasn't right. "I'll take economy today," Emily said, brushing past Claire. "I'd rather not waste my time up here." Claire hesitated. "But you're assigned to first class today." "It's fine," Emily cut her off. "You handle it." Before Claire could argue, Emily disappeared toward the back of the plane, leaving her to finish the first-class service. Claire let out a small sigh before turning toward Robert. "Sir, would you like something to drink before takeoff?" she asked gently. Robert looked up at her, studying her face. Unlike Emily, Claire's expression wasn't dismissive or impatient. She actually looked like she cared. "I'll take a coffee," Robert said, his voice calm. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right over." As Claire walked away, Robert glanced toward the front of the plane. Emily might have thought she had avoided him, but he wasn't the type to let things go. He had seen people like her before, people who only respected wealth and appearances, not integrity. The plane's intercom crackled as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare to depart." Robert pulled the strap across his lap, securing it tightly. He had a feeling that by the time this flight landed, Emily Carter would regret every decision she had made today. As the plane lifted off the runway, Robert felt the familiar pull of gravity pressing him into his seat. He had taken countless flights in his lifetime, but this one felt different. He wasn't just another passenger today. He was a man watching a lesson unfold in real time, a lesson that Emily Carter was about to learn the hard way. Across the aisle, Claire returned with a steaming cup of coffee, carefully placing it on the tray table in front of him. "Here you go, sir. Let me know if you need anything else." Robert gave her a polite nod. "Thank you, young lady." Claire smiled before moving to serve the other passengers. As she worked, Robert noticed how naturally she moved through the cabin, treating everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of who they were. A true professional. The kind of flight attendant this airline needed more of. Meanwhile, in the galley at the back of the plane, Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed, irritation still etched across her face. She was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to the other flight attendants moving around her. "You were pretty hard on that guy in first class," said Mark, a fellow crew member. He was younger than Emily, but had been working in the airline just as long. "What's your problem with him?" Emily scoffed. "Did you see him? He doesn't belong up there. I don't know how he got that ticket, but I guarantee you he didn't pay for it." Mark frowned. "So what? It's not our job to decide who belongs in first class. If his ticket's valid, that's all that matters." Emily rolled her eyes. "Come on, Mark. Be real. First class is for high-paying customers, VIPs, not—" She lowered her voice. "Some old guy in a wheelchair who probably got a free upgrade." Mark shook his head. That's not your call to make. Emily waved him off, not interested in hearing it. Whatever. It's not like he'll complain. People like that don't make a fuss. She turned back to her phone, completely unaware that she had already made the biggest mistake of her career. Back in first class, Robert took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind working. He wasn't a man who needed to announce his authority or demand respect. He had built a company from the ground up, led thousands of employees, and shaped the airline industry into what it was today. But if there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was people who abused their positions to make others feel small. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few taps, he composed a simple message and sent it. Then he placed the phone back down and resumed sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Emily had no idea that her actions had just set something much bigger in motion. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the soft hum of the engines blending with the occasional clinking of glasses in hushed conversations in the first-class cabin. Robert sat comfortably in his seat, his coffee now half finished, watching as the flight attendants moved around. Claire was still tending to passengers, offering drinks and small gestures of kindness that went unnoticed by most but appreciated by those who paid attention. Emily, however, had yet to return. In the galley, Emily leaned against the counter, sighing heavily as she scrolled through her phone. She didn't care much for this flight. It was just another shift, another routine day where she controlled the first-class experience. She had worked with the airline for years and thought she had seen it all. To her, certain people just didn't fit the image of luxury travel. That man in the wheelchair? She had convinced herself that he was a mistake, a glitch in the system. She had no regrets about how she treated him. But as she stood there, her earpiece crackled. "Emily, report to the cockpit immediately." She frowned, pushing herself upright. What could they possibly want? It wasn't normal for flight attendants to be called to the cockpit mid-flight unless it was serious. She made her way down the aisle, not bothering to acknowledge the first-class passengers. When she passed by Robert, he looked at her. Not with anger, not with irritation, but with something worse. Calm certainty, as if he already knew something she didn't. Emily ignored the feeling in her gut and continued to the front of the plane. When she entered the cockpit, the captain, Thomas Greer, was waiting. He was a man of few words, but his presence alone was enough to make anyone straighten their posture. Next to him, on the small screen of the in-flight communication system, was a senior airline executive, Michael Hastings. Emily's stomach tightened slightly. "You called for me, Captain?" she asked, forcing her usual confident tone. Captain Greer didn't waste time. "We just received a message from the executive office regarding a first-class passenger, Mr. Robert Lawson." Emily's brows furrowed. "What about him?" Michael Hastings cleared his throat on the screen. "Ms. Carter, are you aware of who Mr. Lawson is?" Emily hesitated. "Some retired veteran, I think," she said, her voice casual. The silence that followed was heavy. "Mr. Lawson," Michael said slowly, "isn't just some veteran. He is Robert Lawson, the founder of this airline." The words hit Emily like a slap. Her breath caught. "What?" "You heard me," Michael continued. "The man you dismissed, the man you treated as an inconvenience, is the very person responsible for the company you work for. And he has personally reported an issue with your conduct." Emily's face went pale. This wasn't just a minor complaint. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was career-ending. The captain exhaled through his nose, clearly displeased. "We need an explanation. Now." Emily's hands felt clammy as she struggled to find her words. I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought," Michael interrupted, "that because he was in a wheelchair, because he didn't fit the image you had in your head, he didn't belong. Is that correct?" Emily's throat felt dry. She had no good answer, no excuse that would save her. "When we land," Michael said coldly, "you will personally apologize to Mr. Lawson in front of the first-class cabin, and depending on his decision, you may be facing further disciplinary action." Emily swallowed hard. "Further disciplinary action?" The captain leaned forward. "You may not have a job after this flight, Miss Carter." Emily felt her heart pound in her chest. The plane still had hours left in the air, but for her it felt like it was already crashing. Emily stepped out of the cockpit, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The door clicked shut behind her, but the weight of the conversation still pressed down on her like a ton of bricks. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she slowly made her way back through the first-class cabin. Everything looked the same. The passengers were still in their seats, sipping drinks, reading books, or dozing off. The plane hummed steadily as it cut through the sky. But for Emily, everything had changed. Her eyes flickered to Robert Lawson, still seated calmly in 1A. His face was unreadable, but she knew he had heard the announcement calling her to the cockpit. He had been expecting it. The way he simply sat there sipping his coffee, almost like he had already decided how this was going to end. It made her feel even smaller. She hurried past him, avoiding his gaze, and ducked into the galley. Mark, the other flight attendant, was already there, folding napkins for the meal service. He looked up, immediately noticing the change in her expression. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily didn't answer right away. She pressed her palms against the counter, trying to control her breathing. Finally, she whispered, "I screwed up." Mark frowned. "What are you talking about?" Emily swallowed hard. "That old man in first class? The one in the wheelchair? He owns the airline. He's Robert Lawson. I treated him like he didn't belong, and now the executives know." Mark's hands froze mid-fold. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait, you're telling me the guy you dismissed, the one you barely acknowledged, is the founder of this entire airline?" Emily nodded stiffly. "And he reported me." Mark let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Wow, you really messed up, didn't you?" Emily shot him a sharp glare, but he wasn't wrong. She had spent years controlling the cabin, deciding who got special treatment and who didn't. She had convinced herself that she was the authority, that she could judge who deserved respect based on their appearance. But today she had made a judgment that might cost her everything. She exhaled sharply. "They told me I have to apologize to him, in front of everyone." Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And are you actually going to mean it?" Emily flinched at the question. Was she sorry, or was she just sorry she got caught? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not even close. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she stepped out of the galley. The first-class cabin stretched out in front of her, passengers still lost in their own worlds. But she felt exposed, like every set of eyes was already on her, waiting for her to crack. She stole a glance at Robert Lawson, but he hadn't moved. He still sat there, completely composed, as if nothing that had happened earlier had bothered him. That made it worse. She had expected some sort of reaction, anger, frustration, maybe even gloating. But there was nothing, just calm, quiet observation. Claire passed by, carrying a tray with fresh glasses of orange juice. She glanced at Emily, picking up on the tension in her stiff posture. "Everything okay?" she asked. Emily forced a tight nod. "Fine." Claire hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Look, I don't know what happened up front, but if this is about Mr. Lawson, maybe you should just be honest with him." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire shrugged. "You treated him differently. You and I both know that. Maybe instead of thinking about what the airline is making you do, you should think about why you did it in the first place." Emily bristled. She hated the way Claire said it. So simple, like the answer was right in front of her. But she didn't have time to argue. She squared her shoulders and made her way to Robert's seat. She could feel her palms sweating as she stopped beside him, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice controlled but quieter than usual, "I need to speak with you." Robert didn't look surprised. He slowly folded his hands in his lap and turned to face her. "Go ahead." Emily hesitated. She had practiced her apology in her head on the way over. She had planned to say it was a misunderstanding, that she had simply been following procedure. But now, standing in front of him, the words felt wrong. She swallowed. I want to apologize for earlier. If I made you feel unwelcome in first class, that wasn't my intention." Robert didn't react right away. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Then he asked, "Why did you assume I didn't belong here?" Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. That was the question, the one she had been avoiding. She forced a weak smile. "It wasn't personal. She stopped herself. She had been about to say she was just doing her job, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was, she had seen an old man in a wheelchair and made a snap decision. Robert tilted his head slightly. If I had walked onto this plane in a tailored suit instead of rolling in with a wheelchair, would you have questioned my ticket? Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no answer. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Robert nodded, as if he had expected this outcome. You still have a lot to learn, he said simply. And just like that, Emily realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about whether or not she could truly face what she had done. Emily stood frozen beside Robert's seat, her breath shallow as his words settled over her. You still have a lot to learn. The sentence lingered in the air, heavier than she expected. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but somehow it was worse. He wasn't just disappointed. He had already decided that she wasn't worth arguing with. That was the worst part. She forced herself to respond. I know I made a mistake. The words felt unnatural coming from her. She never had to admit fault before. I didn't mean... Robert lifted a hand slightly, cutting her off. You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway. Emily swallowed. I assumed something that I shouldn't have, and I realize now that I was wrong. Robert studied her for a long moment. The hum of the plane filled the silence. She could feel the stares of other first-class passengers now, sensing that something important was happening. Finally, he let out a quiet sigh and leaned back in his seat. It's not me you need to convince, Miss Carter. Emily frowned. What do you mean? He gestured subtly around the cabin. You made me feel small in front of an entire plane full of people. You didn't just question me. You made sure everyone saw it. His tone remained steady, but there was no mistaking the underlying message. If you're truly sorry, you won't just say it to me. Emily's stomach dropped. She already knew where this was going. She shook her head slightly, voice lower now. You want me to apologize in front of everyone? Robert didn't blink. You didn't hesitate to humiliate me in front of them. So why should apologizing be any different? A tight knot formed in Emily's chest. Apologizing privately had been difficult enough, but standing up in front of the entire first-class cabin, admitting that she had treated him unfairly, that was a different level of humiliation. She suddenly felt the need to defend herself. I wasn't trying to humiliate you. Robert raised an eyebrow. Then what were you trying to do? She hesitated. There was no good answer. She had made up her mind about him before he even spoke a word. She had assumed that because he was in a wheelchair, because he wasn't wearing an expensive suit, because he didn't fit the image she was used to, that he wasn't supposed to be here. And now she was being forced to face that mistake in front of everyone. Her hands clenched at her sides. I don't know if I can do that. Robert gave a small nod, as if that told him everything he needed to know. Then you haven't learned anything at all. And with that, he turned back toward the window, dismissing her entirely. Emily stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced. She could walk away now, pretend the conversation never happened, tell herself that apologizing in private had been enough. But deep down, she already knew that wasn't true. And as the weight of her actions pressed down on her, she realized something that made her stomach twist. This wasn't just about saving her job anymore. This was about proving, to Robert, to the passengers, and to herself, that she was capable of change. But was she? Emily stood there, gripping the edge of the nearest seat for support. The quiet hum of the plane, the soft murmur of passengers chatting over their drinks. It all felt muted against the pounding in her chest. Robert had turned away from her, uninterested in continuing the conversation. He had made his point. He had given her a choice, and in his mind, she had already failed the test. But Emily wasn't sure if she was ready to accept that. She looked around, feeling an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. Shame. The first-class passengers who had witnessed her behavior earlier were still there. Some stealing glances, others pretending not to pay attention. But she could feel their judgment pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. If she walked away now, she knew exactly what would happen. The airline executives would still review her actions. Robert Lawson had enough power to have her fired with a single email, and the worst part? She wouldn't even be able to argue against it. She had handed him every reason to do so. But this wasn't just about her job anymore. For years, she had convinced herself that she was good at what she did, that she ran the first-class cabin with efficiency and authority. But today, she was realizing something ugly. She had been using that authority to control, not to serve. She had made judgments about people based on nothing but their appearances, and Robert had caught her in the act. She took a shaky breath and turned back toward him. "Mr. Lawson." He didn't react. He simply continued staring out the window, watching the clouds roll past as if she wasn't even there. She swallowed hard, her voice coming out quieter than before. "You're right." That made him turn. His gaze was steady, unreadable. He didn't say anything, just waited. Emily took a slow breath. Her pride clawed at her throat, begging her to stop, to make an excuse, to walk away. But something else inside her, the part of her that had been forced to face the truth, kept her standing there. "I was wrong," she said louder this time, "and not just about your ticket, about you." A few passengers turned their heads now, their curiosity piqued. Emily forced herself to keep going. "When I saw you in that wheelchair, when I saw your jacket and the way you carried yourself, I assumed things about you that I had no right to assume. I thought you didn't belong in first class. I thought—" She hesitated, then pushed through. "I thought I knew who was supposed to sit here and who wasn't. But I didn't. And for that, I'm sorry." Robert studied her carefully. "And why are you telling me this now?" Emily's fingers dug into her palm. "Because you gave me a choice." His expression didn't change, but she could see the way his gaze sharpened, like he was measuring her sincerity. She took a step back, breathing in deeply before she did what she never thought she would have to do. She turned to face the entire first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice trembling slightly but still strong, "before we continue this flight, I need to take a moment to address something." Now everyone was looking. Her stomach twisted, but she kept going. "Earlier today, I made a mistake, a serious one. I treated a passenger unfairly based on an assumption that should never have been made. I questioned his place in first class, not because of his ticket, but because of my own bias." A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. Emily's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "That passenger is Mr. Robert Lawson. Some of you may know who he is. Some of you may not. But what you should know is that he is not just a first-class passenger. He is the founder of this airline. And today I disrespected him in a way that I never should have." The murmurs grew louder now, passengers exchanging glances. Even those who hadn't paid attention before were locked onto her now. She forced herself to look at Robert again. "Mr. Lawson, I want to publicly apologize to you. Not just because of who you are, but because of what I did. I was wrong, and I am truly sorry." Silence. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. Robert sat there, his expression unreadable. For the first time in her career, Emily felt completely out of control. She wasn't calling the shots anymore. She wasn't the authority in the room. Robert was, and then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded once. "That's a start." The breath Emily had been holding finally escaped. She knew this wasn't over, but for the first time today she had done something right. A ripple of quiet whispers spread through the first-class cabin. Some passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to watch, while others openly observed the scene unfolding before them. The tension still hung thick in the air, but something had shifted. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her hands still clenched at her sides. She had done it. She had forced the words out in front of everyone, spoken them aloud in a way that made it impossible to take back. But instead of feeling relief, she felt something else. Unease. Robert had acknowledged her apology, but the way he said it, "That's a start." That meant there was more to come. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to remain professional. "I'll be checking in on everyone shortly. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything." It was an attempt to bring the moment back to normal, to shift attention away from herself. Some passengers nodded, others looked away, but she could still feel their judgment. The apology was out there now, and she had no choice but to own it. She turned and walked stiffly back toward the galley. As soon as she was behind the curtain, she pressed her hands flat against the counter, sucking in a deep breath. What had she just done? Her mind raced. She had never had to apologize like that before, especially not in front of an audience. The humiliation still burned at the edges of her nerves, but beneath that, there was something deeper, something uncomfortable. She had just admitted out loud that she had judged someone unfairly, that she had let her assumptions control her actions. And the worst part, she had done it so easily. She hadn't even thought twice when she had dismissed Robert earlier. It had been automatic, a decision made without real consideration. And now, standing in the galley, she realized something that made her stomach twist. How many times had she done this before without realizing it? How many other passengers had she treated differently because they didn't fit her expectations? How many people had she ignored, dismissed, or made feel small simply because they didn't look like they belonged in first class? Her hands curled into fists against the counter. Was this who she had always been? A soft voice pulled her out of her thoughts. That was brave. Emily turned sharply. Claire stood nearby, watching her with an unreadable expression. Emily let out a breath. It didn't feel brave. Claire leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. That's because you're actually thinking about what you did. Emily frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Claire shrugged. I've worked with flight attendants who would have done exactly what you did earlier. But if they got caught, they wouldn't care. They'd only apologize because they had to, not because they meant it. Emily bristled. And you think I meant it? Claire studied her for a moment. I think you're starting to. Emily looked away, jaw tight. Starting to. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. A voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet with an estimated landing time of 2:15 p.m. The weather at our destination is clear and warm, with a slight breeze. We hope you're enjoying your flight. Emily straightened, adjusting her uniform. I should get back to work. Claire didn't stop her, but before Emily stepped away, she said one last thing. You know, real change doesn't happen in a single apology. Emily's shoulders stiffened. She didn't turn around, but she heard the meaning behind the words loud and clear. Saying sorry was one thing, proving it was another. She exhaled slowly, then pushed through the curtain and back into the cabin. Her gaze immediately landed on Robert. He was still seated in 1A, but this time he wasn't looking out the window. He was looking directly at her. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then squared her shoulders and stepped forward. She had made her apology, but now she had to prove that she meant it. Emily moved through the first-class cabin with measured steps, aware of every glance in her direction. Even though the passengers had returned to their books, movies, or quiet conversations, she could still feel the weight of her public apology hanging in the air. She wasn't used to being on this side of things, being the one under scrutiny, the one people whispered about. For years, she had controlled this space. She had been the one to decide who received extra attention, who got a warm smile, and who was barely acknowledged. She had told herself it was just part of the job. First-class passengers expected a certain level of service, and she had learned to prioritize those who fit the role of wealth and importance. Now she realized how blind she had been. She forced herself to stop in front of Robert's seat. Would you like anything else, Mr. Lawson? Robert looked up at her, his expression still unreadable. Just water, please. Emily nodded quickly, almost relieved by the simplicity of the request. She turned and went straight to the galley, grabbing a cold bottle of water and a glass with ice. She moved on instinct, performing the task just as she had 1,000 times before. But as she placed the tray in front of Robert, he did something unexpected. He studied her, not in a condescending way, not like he was waiting for her to mess up again. He simply watched her, as if he was trying to understand something. She shifted under the weight of his gaze. Is there anything else I can do for you, sir? Robert tilted his head slightly. Do you believe what you said earlier? Emily's stomach tightened. She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Did she believe it? When she stood up in front of the entire cabin and admitted her mistake, she had done it because she had no choice. She had been called out, exposed, And while she had meant her words in the moment, the deeper question still lingered. Had she really changed? Or had she just said what she needed to say to survive? She cleared her throat, choosing her words carefully. I think I'm beginning to understand what I did wrong. Robert gave a slow nod, as if considering her answer. Then he leaned back slightly in his seat. You know, I started this airline for people like me. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Robert exhaled, looking out the window for a moment before continuing. I served my country for 30 years. When I came home, I was different. Not just because of my injuries, but because the world saw me differently. I went from leading troops in combat to struggling to get a taxi to stop for me. I lost the ability to walk, and somehow that made people assume I lost my value too. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. Robert glanced back at her. So when I built this airline, I made sure that every passenger, regardless of how they looked, how much money they had, or where they came from, was treated with the same respect, because I know what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth. Emily swallowed hard. I didn't know. Robert gave a small smile. Of course you didn't. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to humiliate her. It was simply the truth. She had never thought about it before. She had spent years believing that first class belonged to a certain type of person, never questioning who set those rules. She had never stopped to think about the passengers who didn't fit, but had every right to be here. And now she was face to face with the man who had created this very airline to break that mindset. She felt a lump rise in her throat. Robert took a slow sip of his water before setting it down. You apologize. That's good. But an apology only matters if it leads to change. Emily nodded stiffly, trying to push past the discomfort curling in her stomach. I understand. Robert's gaze stayed on her for a second longer before he nodded once. We'll see. Emily turned quickly, walking back toward the galley before her emotions betrayed her. For the first time since stepping onto this flight, she felt something unfamiliar creeping into her thoughts. Not just regret, but reflection. She had spent years thinking she knew this job inside and out, but now for the first time, she was realizing just how much she still had to learn. Emily gripped the edge of the counter in the galley, her breathing slow and controlled. The reality of the past few hours was starting to settle into her bones, heavier than she expected. She had spent years moving through flights like clockwork, handling passengers, enforcing rules, and keeping things in order. But this feeling of uncertainty, of self-doubt, was something entirely new. She had never questioned herself before. Never had a moment where she genuinely wondered whether she had been doing things the wrong way all along. But Robert Lawson had cracked something open inside her. She had dismissed him without hesitation. She had questioned his right to be in first class before she even looked at his ticket. And now, he wasn't just another passenger. He was the very person who had built the airline she worked for. And he had built it for people like him, people she had ignored. A voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Still thinking about it, huh? She turned sharply to see Mark leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. Emily let out a slow breath. I don't have a choice. Mark raised an eyebrow. You always have a choice. You just didn't think about it before. Emily shot him a glare, but he wasn't wrong. Mark reached for a bottle of water from the fridge, twisting off the cap casually. Look, I've been working with you long enough to know that you don't mess up often. But when you do, you double down instead of admitting it. Emily narrowed her eyes. That's not true, Mark smirked. Isn't it? He took a sip before continuing. You could have just apologized to Robert quietly, right? But instead, you made a scene. Then when the captain called you in, you still tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. And now? He tilted his head slightly. Now you're actually thinking about it. That's new. Emily exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. Why do I feel like you're enjoying this? Mark shrugged. Because it's not often that Emily Carter doesn't have all the answers. She wanted to be annoyed, but the truth was, Mark was right. She had spent years being so sure of herself, so convinced that she understood this job better than anyone. But now she was realizing how little she actually understood about the people she was supposed to be serving. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone buzzing. She turned her head slightly and noticed the in-flight phone on the wall blinking. That was unusual. Most communication from the ground only happened in emergencies. Mark frowned and picked it up. Flight 281, first class cabin. This is Mark speaking. He paused as the voice on the other end responded. His expression shifted, eyes widening slightly. Emily felt a prickle of unease. What? Mark lowered the receiver, his face unreadable. The airline's corporate office just sent a request. They want a meeting with you after we land. Emily's stomach dropped. What? Mark nodded, setting the phone back in its holder. Yep. Apparently Robert Lawson wants a full report on how this flight was handled. And that means they're going to be reviewing everything, including you. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She had assumed the worst was over after she apologized, that she had done the one thing needed to smooth this over. But this wasn't just about a single mistake anymore. Robert was making sure this wouldn't be forgotten. She swallowed hard. Do you think they're going to fire me? Mark studied her for a moment before answering. Honestly, I don't know. Emily turned away, gripping the counter again, her mind racing. She had spent the entire flight trying to repair the damage she had done. But what if it wasn't enough? What if an apology didn't erase the fact that she had exposed exactly who she was? Someone who made snap judgments, who decided who belonged where, who never even questioned whether she was being fair. Her breath felt tight in her chest. She had spent years enforcing the rules, but now for the first time, she was the one being judged. And this time, she had no control over the verdict. Emily gripped the counter tighter, staring blankly at the silverware neatly stacked beside her. The reality of the situation pressed in from all sides. She had thought that standing in front of the first-class cabin and apologizing to Robert would be the hardest part, but now she realized the real challenge hadn't even begun. The corporate office wanted a meeting. That meant this wasn't just about a passenger complaint. This was bigger. Robert Lawson wasn't just letting this go, and if the airline executives were involved, that meant decisions were being made about her future, even as she stood there frozen in place. Mark shifted beside her, watching her reaction carefully. You should start preparing yourself now, Emily. They're not going to be easy on you. Emily scoffed, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. You think I don't know that? Mark held up his hands. I'm just saying, this is Robert Lawson we're talking about. He doesn't do things halfway. Emily turned sharply to face him. What does that mean? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I don't know him personally, but everyone in the industry knows what kind of man he is. He built this airline from the ground up. He's respected, not just because he was a successful businessman, but because he actually cares about the way people are treated. Emily crossed her arms. And you think I don't care? Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Do you? Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Did she? She had spent years believing she was good at her job, that she ran first class efficiently, that she knew how to handle difficult passengers, that she understood what was expected of her. But the truth was, she had never really cared about the people in the seats. She had cared about control. She had cared about order. She had cared about making sure first class stayed exactly how she thought it should be. Polished, expensive, predictable. And today, that belief had shattered. She swallowed hard, suddenly feeling lightheaded. She needed to get out of this galley. I need some air, she muttered, stepping past Mark before he could respond. She pushed through the curtain and into the first-class cabin. The passengers barely noticed her, except for one. Robert Lawson. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. He wasn't pretending to ignore what had happened. He was watching her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she moved past his row, heading toward the small crew area near the front of the plane. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a brief moment, trying to breathe. This was just another flight, just another situation to handle. Except, it wasn't. Nothing about this was routine. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a bottle of water, twisting off the cap and taking a slow sip. She had faced difficult passengers before, rude businessmen who snapped their fingers at her, entitled travelers who demanded impossible things. She had learned to brush it off, to keep moving, to stay in control. But this wasn't some rude passenger. This was the owner of the airline, A man who had built everything she took for granted. A man who had lived through struggles she had never even considered. A man she had insulted, dismissed, and humiliated without a second thought. And now he held her career in his hands. A voice startled her out of her thoughts. Running away isn't going to change anything. Emily turned to see Claire standing nearby, arms folded. Emily huffed. I'm not running. Claire raised an eyebrow. Then what are you doing? Emily glanced past her, back toward the cabin. She could still feel Robert's presence, the weight of his stare, even though she wasn't looking directly at him. She exhaled slowly. I don't know. Claire studied her carefully. You've been a flight attendant for what? 6 years? 7, Emily corrected automatically. Claire nodded. And in those 7 years, how many times have you actually thought about the way you treat passengers? Emily's jaw tightened. I treat passengers just fine. Claire tilted her head. Do you? Emily's fingers curled around the water bottle. What do you want me to say, Claire? That I was wrong? That I should have treated Robert Lawson differently? That I should have treated all passengers differently? Claire didn't flinch. I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to think about it. Emily let out a sharp breath. I've been thinking about it. Claire gave a small nod. Good, because Robert Lawson isn't just going to accept an apology and let this go. He's testing you, Emily. He wants to see what kind of person you really are. Emily frowned. And what if he doesn't like what he sees? Claire held her gaze. Then you lose everything. The words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She wanted to argue, to push back, to say that she didn't need anyone's approval. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had spent years believing she had authority. But today she had learned that authority meant nothing if it wasn't backed by respect. And for the first time in 7 years, Emily wasn't sure if she had ever earned it. She swallowed hard, straightened her uniform, and turned back toward the first-class cabin. She couldn't change what had already happened. But maybe, just maybe, she could change what happened next. Emily walked back into the first-class cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had spent years thinking she was in control, but today she was realizing how little control she actually had. The passengers around her had moved on, some sleeping, some sipping their drinks, some watching movies. But to her, the weight of what had happened still sat in the air, thick and unmoving. She glanced toward Robert Lawson, who was now flipping through the airline's in-flight magazine, his expression unreadable. Even though he wasn't looking at her, Emily knew he was still watching. Not in an obvious way, but in the way a man like him always watched, quietly calculating, waiting to see what she would do next. Her apology had been step 1, but now she knew something far worse was coming. The meeting. Her hands tightened at her sides. The corporate office had already been informed. Robert had made sure of it. That meant the moment this plane touched down, she would be stepping into a room with the airline's executives, forced to defend herself. Forced to answer for something she couldn't take back. She had been in difficult situations before. She had argued with passengers who were drunk and disorderly. She had handled emergency landings. She had even been forced to remove people from flights. But this was the first time she was the one on trial. Emily turned, moving to the galley to grab a glass of water, hoping it would steady her nerves. She barely noticed Mark stepping in behind her. You good? He asked casually, leaning against the counter. Emily scoffed. Do I look good? Mark smirked. Not really. You look like you just got sentenced to life in prison. Emily rolled her eyes, taking a slow sip of her water. Might as well be. You heard about the meeting? Mark nodded. Yeah, and I also heard that Robert Lawson is the kind of guy who doesn't forget things like this. Emily exhaled sharply. Great. That makes me feel so much better. Mark shrugged. I'm just saying, if you go in there acting like you're only sorry because you got caught, they'll eat you alive. You need to decide, right now, what you're actually fighting for. Are you fighting to keep your job, or are you fighting to prove you've actually learned something? Emily frowned, turning to him fully. Aren't those the same thing? Mark shook his head. Not even close. Emily's jaw tightened. Then what do you think I should do, Mark? Give some emotional speech? Beg for another chance? Mark held up his hands. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that Robert Lawson is watching you. Every move you make from now until we land is going to determine what he tells the corporate office. You need to decide if you're going to pretend to be the perfect flight attendant for the rest of this flight, or if you're actually going to prove that you can change. Emily's stomach twisted. She didn't like being told she was being tested. She had spent years believing she was the one testing others. Passengers, new flight attendants, anyone who stepped into her first-class cabin. She had been the one with power. But now she was the one being judged. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she would pass the test. She took another sip of water before setting the glass down, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. You really think he's paying that much attention? Mark smirked. Oh, I know he is. And I also know that when we land, the executives aren't going to ask you how you feel about this. They're going to ask him. They're going to ask Robert Lawson if he believes you deserve to stay here. Emily's pulse pounded. It was worse than she thought. She had assumed she would get a standard review, maybe a suspension, maybe a warning. But if the decision was being left up to Robert, that meant she wasn't walking into a corporate review. She was walking into a sentencing. She turned back toward the first-class cabin, forcing herself to stand straighter, her hands smoothing out the front of her uniform. If she was going to prove she had changed, she needed to start now. No more avoiding eye contact. No more waiting for the flight to end. She had to step up. Emily scanned the cabin, looking for any passenger who needed assistance. Normally, she would have focused on the wealthy businessmen first, the ones who expected top-tier service. But this time, she forced herself to see everyone. A few rows back, an older woman struggled to reach her carry-on bag. Her frail arms stretched toward the overhead bin, but she couldn't quite get a grip on it. Emily moved before she had time to think. She stepped up beside the woman, her voice softer than usual. Let me help you with that, ma'am. The woman turned, relief flooding her expression. Oh, thank you, dear. My arms aren't as strong as they used to be. Emily smiled, a real one this time. That's what I'm here for. She gently lifted the bag and secured it back in the bin before stepping aside. If you need anything else, just press your call button, okay? The woman nodded gratefully. You're very kind, dear. Emily hesitated for half a second before nodding back. I try to be. As she turned away, her gaze instinctively flicked toward Robert. He was still watching. And this time, he nodded, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. Emily exhaled. This wasn't about grand speeches or dramatic gestures. This was about proving, moment by moment, that she wasn't the same person who had dismissed him at the gate. She had 7 years of bad habits to undo, and she only had a few hours left to prove she could. Emily felt a shift inside her, one she couldn't quite put into words. She had spent the last few years believing she understood what it meant to be a flight attendant. Keep order, maintain control, prioritize first-class passengers who fit the standard. That was how she had operated. She had never questioned it because she had never been forced to, until now. Now she was seeing everything differently. She moved through the cabin with new awareness. For the first time, she wasn't just checking off tasks or moving through motions. She was paying attention. A young man in a wrinkled button-up shirt sat near the window, his foot nervously bouncing as he tapped his phone screen over and over. She had seen passengers like him before, nervous flyers, first-timers, or maybe someone with bad experiences on planes. Normally, she wouldn't have noticed. But now she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he exhaled sharply every time the plane jolted slightly. She walked over, her voice calm but natural. Can I get you anything? The man startled slightly, blinking up at her. Oh, no, I'm fine. Emily didn't move. You sure? First time flying? He let out a small, breathless laugh. First time in a long time. He gestured toward the window. I used to travel a lot, but then I had a bad flight a few years ago. Haven't been able to get back on a plane since. Emily nodded. Normally, she would have moved on already, but instead she leaned slightly toward him, lowering her voice. You know what helped me when I started flying? The man tilted his head. What? Distraction, she said simply. Movies, music, even just talking to someone. You don't have to sit in silence and let your thoughts get the best of you. She glanced at his screen. Want a recommendation? We have some really bad action movies on the entertainment system that are actually kind of great. The man chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. All right, hit me with your best so bad it's good movie. Emily smirked. Shark Tornado 3. It's exactly what it sounds like. The man let out a real laugh this time. That sounds terrible. Emily nodded. It is. And it's perfect. She moved on before he could thank her, but as she walked away, she saw him scroll through the in-flight options, searching for the movie. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had actually helped someone. She turned back toward the galley, but before she reached it, her eyes caught Robert Lawson once again. He was still watching, not with the quiet judgment she had seen before. Now there was something different in his expression. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he believed she was trying. The flight continued smoothly, but for Emily, it was anything but routine. She spent the next hour moving through the cabin, actively looking for ways to improve the experience for every passenger. She helped a mother calm her fussy toddler by offering a coloring book. She refilled drinks before people even had to ask. She made sure every passenger, regardless of whether they were wearing a business suit or a hoodie, was treated with the same level of attentiveness. It was exhausting, but something strange was happening. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was forcing a performance. She actually felt like she was doing her job the way it was meant to be done. And the more she did it, the more she realized how much she had been missing. She had spent years prioritizing passengers who expected to be treated like VIPs, never thinking about the ones who didn't demand attention, but deserved it just as much. Now she was seeing them all, and she wasn't just seeing them, she was serving them. The final stretch of the flight approached, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into our destination. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all tray tables are in the upright position. Flight attendants will be coming around for final checks. Thank you for flying with us. Emily moved through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts, collecting last-minute trash, making sure everything was in order. When she reached Robert's row, she hesitated. He looked up at her, waiting. Emily took a steady breath before speaking. Do you need anything else before we land, Mr. Lawson? For the first time since the flight began, Robert smiled. I think I'm good. Emily nodded. All right, if you change your mind, let me know. She turned to walk away, but before she could take a step, Robert's voice stopped her. Ms. Carter, she turned back. Yes, sir? Robert studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. You did well today. Emily's throat tightened. She wasn't sure why, but those 4 words meant more to her than she expected. She didn't trust herself to speak right away, so she simply nodded back. Thank you, sir. Robert didn't say anything else. He simply turned back toward the window, as if that single sentence had been all that needed to be said. But Emily knew what it meant. The test wasn't just about what she had done in the past. It was about what she was willing to do to be better. And today she had proved that she could be. But the real question was still waiting for her. The moment they landed, she would have to face the corporate office. And even though Robert had acknowledged her efforts, his opinion wasn't the only one that mattered. Would the executives see what he had seen, or was it too late to convince them? Emily didn't know, but this time, she was ready to find out. The plane's wheels touched down with a slight jolt, the soft hum of the engines shifting as they reversed thrust to slow the aircraft. Around her, passengers began stirring, stretching their arms, collecting their belongings. The end of the flight was always the busiest moment for a flight attendant, coordinating deplaning, making sure everyone exited smoothly, ensuring no items were left behind. But for Emily Carter, this landing wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As the plane taxied to the gate, her pulse pounded in her ears. Any moment now, Robert Lawson would be stepping off this plane, and soon after, she would be walking into a meeting that could decide the rest of her career. Would she be fired? Suspended? Given another chance? She had no way of knowing. The seatbelt sign switched off with a ding, and passengers immediately reached for their bags. Emily stood near the exit, hands clasped in front of her, forcing herself to focus. She had a job to do, and no matter what happened after today, she was going to finish it properly. One by one, passengers trickled out. The businessman she had served earlier gave her a polite nod as he passed. The nervous young man who had watched Shark Tornado 3 on her suggestion gave her a small smile and a thumbs up. The elderly woman she had helped with her bag whispered a quiet, "Thank you, dear," before stepping off the plane. Every interaction reminded Emily of something she had never truly understood before today. It wasn't about who people were, it was about how you treated them. And then, Robert Lawson stood up. The first-class passengers had mostly cleared out, leaving only a few lingering in the back. Emily braced herself as Robert slowly adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and rolled his wheelchair toward the exit. He stopped just inches from her. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then in a calm and measured voice, Robert said the words she had been waiting for. "You did well, Ms. Carter." Emily felt something shift inside her. It wasn't praise, not really. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was acknowledgement, a sign that he had seen her, not just her mistake, but her efforts to correct it. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Thank you, sir." Robert nodded once, then turned and rolled off the plane, disappearing down the jet bridge. Emily exhaled, her hands gripping the fabric of her uniform. She wasn't sure what that meant, but she had a feeling she would find out soon. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes after landing. Emily barely had time to finish her post-flight duties before heading toward the executive offices. Her steps felt heavier with each one she took, the weight of everything pressing down on her. When she arrived at the corporate office lounge, she was met with a sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit. "Emily Carter." Emily straightened. "Yes." The woman gave her a brief once-over before gesturing for her to follow. "This way." The hallway leading to the meeting room felt endless. Each step echoed slightly, making the tension even worse. Emily forced herself to breathe evenly, to stay calm. When the doors finally opened, she stepped inside and immediately felt the air shift. The room wasn't filled with executives. It wasn't some boardroom packed with higher-ups ready to fire her. It was just one person, Robert Lawson. Emily stopped short, blinking in surprise. "Please, have a seat." His voice was calm even, not cruel, not angry, just expectant. Emily slowly lowered herself into the chair across from him, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. "I thought this was a corporate review," she said cautiously. Robert smiled slightly. "It is, but as it turns out, the executives trust my judgment on this matter." Emily swallowed hard. So this was it. Her career, her future. It was in Robert Lawson's hands. Robert folded his hands on the table, watching her closely. "Tell me something, Ms. Carter. Why do you want to keep this job?" Emily hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to say the right thing. Finally, she spoke. "Because I want to do it right this time." Robert nodded slightly as if he had been expecting that. "And why should I believe that?" he asked. Emily took a slow breath. "Because I know what I did wrong, and I know I can't undo it. But what I can do is make sure it never happens again." She met his gaze firmly. "I thought being a flight attendant meant controlling things, making sure everything ran perfectly. But I was wrong. It's not about control, it's about service. And today I finally understood that." Robert leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You were arrogant," he said. "Dismissive, quick to judge." Emily nodded. "I was." Robert studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "You're not a bad flight attendant, Miss Carter. But before today, you were a selfish one. And that's worse." Emily felt those words settle in her chest. They were blunt, honest, but they weren't cruel. And then, Robert sighed and leaned forward. "You have one chance." Emily's breath caught. "One chance?" Robert nodded. "You won't be fired, but you will be monitored. Every flight you take for the next 6 months will be under review. If I hear even one report that you've fallen back into old habits, you're done. No warnings, no second chances. Understood?" Emily nodded quickly. "Understood." Robert stood, adjusting his jacket. Then we're done here. Emily rose as well, her legs feeling weak. She wasn't sure what to say. Thank you? I'm sorry again. But before she could speak, Robert gave her one last look. You can either prove me wrong or prove me right. Then without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She wasn't fired. She wasn't suspended. But she had been given a choice. Stay the same or actually change. And this time, she was going to prove Robert Lawson right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.